which will be somewhat wide-ranging. My name is Megan Mullin. I'm an associate professor of environmental politics at the Nicholas School, and I'm really excited to be a part of this panel on North Carolina water issues writ large, but really sort of thinking about states and localities and how they interact with one another to balance the many values that we're trying to maximize when we provide water service. And so we're going to change the order a bit from what we have in the program and start with Lisa Schiavinato, who's co-director of the NC Coastal Resources Law, Planning, and Policy Center, and adjunct professor of University of North Carolina School of Law. And she's going to sort of set the frame for us in thinking mostly at the state level about nutrient pollution, regulating nutrient pollutants, and provide this overall framework at the state level, and then we're going to drill down to the local level with our next speakers.
Thank you very much. So good morning, everybody. I don't actually have a PowerPoint. I'm just going to talk from my notes here, so that'll be a little bit different from probably the previous discussion. And I think that my talk will definitely be a lot different from the previous panels. It's going to be a lot more policy focused and not really litigation focused. So at my Law and Policy Center, we don't represent clients and we don't go to trial. We are I guess some people like to think of us as a think tank, but I like to think of us as an action tank because we actually we like to do more than just kind of publish white papers and journals. We actually kind of go out into coastal communities and help them with their issues. And I think a lot of ways we work at the intersection of science, policy, and law. So I find myself working most often with scientists and engineers and not attorneys. So anytime I have a chance to hobnob with my people, I always readily accept that. So I am going to be talking about nutrient pollution issues here, and I'm going to be very specific about it in talking about current state-level efforts to develop what's called numeric nutrient criteria. This is something that is in its very early stages at the state level, and it's being led by the Department of Environmental Quality through the Division of Water Resources and the Albemarle-Pamlico National Estuary Partnership. So in my talk, I'm going to begin at the broad level, the nationwide level, then really talk about what the state is doing. But I will be talking a little bit about the law because there is a case that is actually on point to some of these efforts that North Carolina is doing that might provide some lessons learned. I'm going to be a little technical in my discussion. I'll try not to be too technical about the science because no one's going to want that. But if you've taken admin law already, probably my discussion of the case will actually be a lot easier for you to understand. So very broadly, when Congress passed the modern version of the Clean Water Act in 1972, the goal was restoring and maintaining the nation's waters. And in doing so, Congress emphasized the importance of developing and implementing what's called area-wide treatment planning processes, which is a really big phrase, to control the sources of pollutants, which you heard in the previous presentation. The definition of pollutants is actually really broad in federal law, but as you know from the state and local levels, the devil is in the details with implementation. So to help achieve this goal, the Clean Water Act governs the standards and the enforcement of effluent limitations, in part to address nutrient pollutions in our waterways. And way back in the mid-1990s, EPA submitted a report to Congress that was a national summary of water quality conditions, and it actually cited nutrient pollution as a major cause of impaired waters. And so nutrient pollution is caused by excess nutrients, mostly in the form of nitrogen and phosphorus, which are actually naturally occurring elements in aquatic ecosystems. Now, elements like nitrogen and phosphorus are necessary for healthy ecosystems, but if you have too much of it, it can cause a lot of different problems. So high levels of nutrients in waterways can, in one way, cause algae to grow faster than ecosystems can handle. And significant increases in algae, it can reduce water quality, it could impact habitat, food resources, decrease levels of oxygen that fish and other wildlife need to survive, One of the more well-known consequences of excess nutrients are harmful algal blooms. We read about this fairly frequently in the news media. And that can reduce or actually eliminate oxygen in the water, and this usually leads to fish kills. And in fact, nutrients were cited as a cause of numerous hypoxic events in the Gulf of Mexico and in the eastern states throughout the 90s. It continues today when you read about dead zones. You read about them in the Gulf of Mexico, sometimes on the West Coast as well. And algal blooms can not just harm ecosystems, it can harm humans by producing elevated toxins and bacterial growth that can cause illness when you come in contact with the water, if you eat tainted fish or shellfish, or you actually drink the contaminated water. But, these issues are not just economic or public health or environmental, it's also economic, because having algal blooms or excess nutrients in your waterways can actually eliminate or reduce public access to waterways as well. So that can affect local communities that rely on access to public waterways for basically to make money. And if you are a community on the coast, that's pretty much your lifeblood for your economy. So the EPA identified nutrient pollution as a costly and challenging environmental problem. And in the late 1990s, they found a lot of evidence that traditional types of criteria, called narrative criteria, I am going to explain what these mean a little bit later, was really not enough to deter nutrient pollution. And so as a result, EPA, they issued yet another report in 2003, basically directing all states to develop what's called numeric nutrient standards. And right now, numerous states have attempted to develop numeric criteria with varying levels of success, but North Carolina is actually one of those states that's working with EPA and a whole suite of stakeholders in order to try to make this happen. And to back up a little bit about federal law, so when Congress adopted the Clean Water Act, it recognized the primary responsibility of states to reduce or prevent pollution, because states and local governments are usually in the best situation to be able to determine what water quality standards should be. They know the ecosystems, they know the communities, and so they're in a better position than the federal government to be able to articulate standards. But basically, a state's allowed to enforce its own water quality laws with approval from EPA, of course, so long as effluent limitations are not less stringent than those that are established by the Clean Water Act. And so the Clean Water Act, they actually identify 3 legal terms of art in explaining the roles of the federal government and the state. So you have uses, criteria, and standards. And from a regulatory standpoint, it is EPA that defines criteria as, and I'm going to speak directly from the rule here, elements of state water quality standards expressed as constituent concentrations, levels, or narrative statements representing a quality of water that supports a particular use. These words are very important because it's the state that designates the uses of its waters, and they therefore set water quality criteria for waters based upon those uses. So there's always that connection. You establish what your uses in your water are, and then you develop criteria that supports the protection of those uses. So, and all of this is obviously to protect public health, the general welfare, all of these different types of things, to protect certain values that we have, that we hold for our water. However, if a state standard is found to be inconsistent with Clean Water Act requirements, or the EPA determines that new standards or revised standards are necessary, the agency is actually mandated to actually do this for the state. And as you can imagine, that can create a lot of tension between EPA and the states if the state is usually the one that has been delegated the responsibility of implementing clean water standards, but there might be some occasions when EPA has to step in and do it for them. And I say this because this will apply later on when I talk about a legal case out of Florida. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about narrative versus numeric criteria. And you can actually think about the distinction between the two by using speed limits as an analogy. So this was actually in the federal district court decision of the case I'm going to talk about, and I think the judge did a really good job of really breaking it down into lay terms. So a state could adopt a narrative standard for speed limits. Don't drive too fast. However, that might be considered to be an unclear standard subject to interpretation. So what do we have now? We have numeric limits. 70 miles per hour on highways. Or a state could choose to have a combination of numeric and narrative standards. Speed limit is 70, but don't drive too fast under certain conditions. So sometimes you kind of see that if it's snowing or raining really hard outside, it may not be very smart to go 70, even though technically you're allowed to. So let me see here. So I kind of wanted to be able to tell you really, from a regulatory standpoint, what the difference between numeric and narrative is when you're actually talking about clean water standards. And really, the difference is numeric criteria, they're generally expressed as numerical concentrations. I had mentioned that before, mass quantities or loadings. And a lot of states have actually, in fact, in their transition from narrative to numeric standards, they basically just transitioned their narrative standards into numeric terms, which I know sounds a little confusing, but here's kind of how you break it down. So numeric criteria, I took this directly from an example on EPA's website. For the protection of human health against the ingestion of contaminated water and contaminated aquatic organisms, the ambient water quality criterion for cadmium, that was their example, is recommended to be identical to the existing drinking water standard, which is 10 micrograms per liter, versus a narrative standard for the protection of various oils and water bodies. Surface waters shall be virtually free from floating non-petroleum oils of vegetable or animal origin, as well as petroleum-derived oils. And so one of the reasons why EPA is really pushing for numeric standards right now is that obviously the numeric is a little bit more specific. It's a little bit easier, in their opinion, to structure a permit around. It's a little bit easier for enforcement if you actually have some numbers attached to what the level is for whatever element you're trying to protect against there. But on the other hand, narrative standards, they could be flexible, they could be site-specific, which sometimes the state would like to have because uses can change, standards can change, circumstances can change, and narrative standards sometimes allow the state to be a little bit more flexible with how they apply their criteria. So you can kind of see the pros and cons of both. And so now I'm going to move on to what's relevant in North Carolina law and kind of what's going on right now. So according to the statutes, it is a public policy of the state to maintain, protect, enhance water quality in our waters, and the state has charged the Department of Environmental Quality with the power to administer programs for water conservation and pollution abatement and declare that standards shall be designated to protect human health, to prevent injury to plant and animal life, to prevent damage to public and private property, yada, yada, yada. And in addition, the General Assembly has charged the Environmental Management Commission with establishing rules to protect, preserve, and enhance the state's waters. And so the ENC is really the rulemaking body. It is the DEQ, specifically the Division of Water Resources, that's in charge of actually implementing it. So the EMC considers several groups of factors when assigning classifications to waters. We have several classifications that are in our rules. The physical characteristics of the water, land development, taking into consideration current, future, or potential uses of the water, the value and use of those waters, and the natural quality of the groundwater, paying particular attention to the vulnerability to pollution from wastewater and other substances. And so North Carolina is actually ahead of a lot of other states in terms of classifications. Instead of having like one or two classifications, it actually has lots, several of them. So they have freshwater, tidal salt waters, and then supplemental classifications for trout waters, swamp waters, nutrient-sensitive waters, outstanding resource waters, high-quality waters, future water supply, and unique wetlands. So basically, DWR is kept very busy. And so the EMC assigns classifications and defines best uses of waters, all according to the standards that are set forth in statute and their implementing rules. However, of course, they have to follow federal guidelines in order to do that. If anybody wants me to actually cite the actual rules and everything too, I can do that, but I'm kind of wanting to move along here a little bit because I want to stay close to our time. So what's going on right now in North Carolina with wanting to develop numeric criteria? So when EPA set out its original report in 1998, asking everybody, hey, it's a good idea to develop numeric nutrient criteria, North Carolina, they said, okay, we'll do that. And so in 2004, they adopted what's called a nutrient criteria implementation plan. But this plan was updated in June 2014 because every 10 years you kind of want to be able to kind of take stock of your current plan and if there are any changes that need to happen. And basically at the end of the day, still an issue with nutrient levels in our waters, and so they thought, well, we need to have an updated plan in order to take care of this. And so the new plan is actually called the Nutrient Criteria Development Plan. So the rationale behind it was basically that despite the state's rigorous yet flexible standards, nutrients continue to negatively affect our water quality. And so the state agreed with EPA that it would think about developing strategies of numeric nutrient criteria to protect designated uses. And so this is a new process, obviously, since it only started in 2014. And so from a public policy perspective, the agency decided we need to get some public input first. And so that's what they've been doing. They had a pretty rigorous stakeholder process from December 2012 up through February 2014. They had a nutrient forum in 2010. They collected and analyzed a lot of stakeholder input. They had public forums where the public was invited to attend and things of that nature. And so a lot of this input, it informed the development plan, which was submitted to EPA in June 2014. And so EPA accepted this plan. They decided this sounds like a good idea. We support you moving forward. And so the main action items to come out of this was if you want to establish numeric nutrient criteria, you have to have a scientific advisory committee there to assist the agency with development. They selected 3 critical areas for development of numeric criteria in the near future: High Rock Lake, which is by Salisbury, by 2018, Albemarle Sound by 2020, and the lower portion of the Cape Fear River Basin by 2021, with adoption statewide by 2025. That's a mighty short time frame to do a lot of that. And since June 2014, DEQ has established a nutrients work group. They continue to work with EPA, and right now they're really at the data collection stage. They're identifying what gaps there are in the data, additional stakeholders that they need to work with in all of this, because it's a pretty big change moving to these numeric standards. Nobody's really sure what's going to come out of it at the end of the day, what types of recommendations, but really what it is they want to do is they want to include as many people in this process as they can. But right now, a lot of it is data collection, which I know for our purposes is not very interesting or very sexy, but that's kind of where they're at, and kind of where we came in as part of this early effort to gather information. The agency called up my office and said, hey, we would like to take a look at maybe any legal ramifications, any legal issues that we might need to be aware of when we're developing this criteria so we don't run afoul of the law, we don't get sued, and then it takes 20 years before we can implement our standards. So we did a little research and we found literally there was like one case that's out there on this, because a lot of this is highly technical, it's highly regulatory. There's not going to be a lot of high-level appellate court or Supreme Court decisions on it. The only thing we're able to find was a federal district court decision that was in 2012, Florida Wildlife Federation versus Jackson. And the very short story of this, I actually have an article coming out with the special issue of your journal associated with this symposium that gives all the details, so I'm not going to go through all of them. The gist of it is Florida agreed in 2003 it would develop numeric criteria. There were a lot of problems with them moving forward with this. A lot of this was political in nature. Some of it was scientific in nature, in being able to gather enough science to be able to develop criteria that was going to pass the arbitrary and capricious standard of administrative law. So basically, years and years passed, EPA said, you're moving too slow, so we're going to develop your criteria for you. And so they did that in 2009, and that just led to an explosion. So in this case, it's Florida Wildlife Federation, but it was really 13 parties that were suing in this case. You had everybody suing. You had industry, you had utilities, you had state agencies, you had environmental groups. Basically, nobody was happy with EPA. And so there were several different claims that were before Judge Hinkle. Most of it really focused on whether the EPA was arbitrary or capricious in deciding that numeric criteria was necessary for Florida waters. And then they wanted to sue based on the fact that they thought the criteria themselves were wrong, and then they had a beef with the process the EPA used to develop those standards. So if you know admin law, you know arbitrary or capricious is a highly deferential standard to the agency. But you might think, oh, well, maybe EPA, they basically won the case. Well, basically they did. However, they actually were, a couple of different types of criteria were invalidated. So it was basically the stream criteria on this. But what was interesting was why the judge shot him down. So basically, they found they couldn't defer to the EPA in how it approached to translating Florida's existing narrative criteria based on the language that was in Florida's rules. So basically, EPA said, we're going to establish numeric criteria for you based on your own rules, not our rules. And so basically, the judge said you did it wrong. So specifically, the language in the Florida rule is nutrient concentrations of a body of water must not be altered so as to cause an imbalance in natural populations of aquatic flora and fauna. Everybody was fighting over what imbalance meant. So the district court interpreted imbalance to mean that Florida's narrative criteria was to prevent harmful changes in nutrient levels, and EPA interpreted it to mean any change in nutrient levels. And the twist to this is that the judge said basically EPA was free to develop any criteria that they wanted, but because they said they wanted to follow Florida's rules, they had to follow Florida's rules. And because they didn't do that, it got shot down as arbitrary or capricious. So, and not only that, they claimed they would defer to Florida's judgment. They didn't, and then they didn't explain why they didn't do this. So I know that all sounds really technical, really specific, but in admin law, that's basically how you win and you lose cases. So in conclusion, so North Carolina has embarked in what is being called a once-in-a-generation opportunity to revise and refine its nutrient pollution standards. Once in a generation doesn't belong to me. One of my colleagues, Jim Hawhey, who works for the Division of Water Resources, when we were talking about this is how he put it. And it's definitely going to be a highly complex task. It's going to require a lot of deliberation, application of sound science, and it's going to have to include experts from across sectors and across disciplines. And it's going to include law, not just the hard sciences, the soft sciences, and then also policy. So, I did a lot of looking into case studies, in many different states, looking at the efforts that they have done, to see if there was any lessons learned for North Carolina. Not a whole lot out there, but what's really important for our state is that you probably read in the paper, we've recently reached a milestone of 10 million residents, with most of that growth being in the Raleigh and the Charlotte metro areas. So effectively managing nutrient impairments in a rapidly growing state like ours is going to be a continuing challenge, because additional development and urbanization to accommodate this growth is going to likely result into more runoff. So the time is here, and the time is right for the state to really take advantage of what's being called this once-in-a-generation opportunity to be able to really look at its nutrient pollution standards and revise them to be able to protect the environment, but to also accommodate growth, because in North Carolina, they also like to look at not just the ecosystem values of our waterways, but also looking at the cost to implement standards and what the impacts are going to be at the local level. So it's a very early process. Don't know how it's going to come out, but there is a timeline that is set, and as Florida might tell you, sometimes it's important to stick to your timeline unless you have a good reason not to. But this is something, if you're interested in this issue, is something to watch, and I'm sure there's going to be many opportunities for more papers to be written, which is really good for me. And I'd be glad to take questions after these folks here present. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Lisa. You have a presentation, right? Okay. So while Vicki and James are pulling up their presentation, that's it's sort of a nice framing to start this, because Lisa really elaborated on the complexity of the standard setting process, right? And that's a particularly complex issue, right? We have emerging science. We have a lot of variation in the severity of the problem. We have standards that are going to be dependent on use, right, which is different from a lot of our regulatory frameworks. But it's just sort of one example, right? Localities are going to be on the receiving end of this process, and so many others, right? And so localities are in this position of needing to comply with rules about source water protection, rules about, drinking water quality, and that affects all of their decisions about infrastructure development, decisions about land use, decisions about water treatment and wastewater treatment, right? And so while they're in that compliance mode, they also have to think about what their communities value. And do their communities want growth restrictions or not? How willing are their communities to pay for compliance through taxes or water rates? And so we're going to get now some framing of that community, local level perspective, first from the city of Durham, where we have Vicki Westbrook, who's Assistant Director of the Department of Water Management, and James Lim, who is Water Efficiency and Conservation Program Manager for the city of Durham. And here about sort of the utility side, although Vicki said she's hesitant to use the word utility after the last panel, but the utility side of local water provision, and we'll hear a little bit more about the governance side in the next presentation.
Thank you very much. The City of Durham Department of Water Management provides the water that you drink every day when you flush the toilet in there, and I love that you're using water-efficient toilets. It's going to one of our 2 treatment plants. So, we are regulated every day, everything that we do, whether it's how we do a water bill, but everything about how we treat the water, how we transfer the water, what we do with it when it's in our possession. We want it to stay in the pipes, all the pipes that it's in, and go to a treatment facility. We don't want any leaking. We want all of that stuff so that when you turn on the tap, you don't think about us. When you flush the toilet, it goes away, and you're grateful for that. And then we do that with, in our department, we have 333 FTEs and about a 10% vacancy rate. And we have a range of employees from senior laborers to water plant operators, wastewater plant operators, meter readers, although we do use high-tech drive-by meter reading. We have engineers, we have distribution system folks, we have collection system folks, and then we have other folks who implement programs, and that's why James Lim is here, because he's going to talk about some of the tools that we use every day to try and help our customers. The department's mission is we want to do all of that and make sure that we meet the customer's expectations and that we're meeting all of those regulatory requirements. So all of the rules that Lisa was talking about, the Safe Drinking Water Act being on the water treatment side of things, and the names of things that continue floating around. They use the term CCR in the coal ash. Well, oh no, that's Consumer Confidence Report that we've been having to do, which is why we don't call it that. We call it a Water Quality Report. So we have all of these different rules and regulations that we're always taking care of. We have the Clean Water Act, which is on the discharges from the wastewater treatment facilities, or as we like to call them, water reclamation facilities, because there is a beneficial product therein. And we've come a long way from where they used to call it. Our city engineer, when I first came to work for the city of Durham, he used to call it the sewer plant, and that just, I'm so glad we have advanced many times. We are situated on a ridge line, so we have 2 lakes in northern Durham County, drainage basins that provide the raw water supply. We have 2 water treatment plants, one of which you probably see on a very regular basis right there off of Hillendale and Hillsborough, built in 1917, still in use today. The other one is on Infinity Road in northern Durham, which is a very short road. We have a combined capacity of 52 million gallons per day, but we treat about half capacity. We are about 26 million gallons per day. Then we have a system of about 1,200 distribution lines, 1,100 collection system lines, and then we have the 2 water reclamation facilities. The ridgeline piece is important because it runs roughly along 147. Anything north of 147 goes to our water reclamation facility on Club Boulevard. Anything south is going to run to the South Durham Water Reclamation Facility. And it's important to note that for some wastewater, Research Triangle Park and areas are served by a county-owned and operated water reclamation facility. One of the things that we're all dealing with is just the availability of water. And this is a picture of the earth. You know, how much water is available for drinking water purposes is that 1%. There is the little orange 2%. You probably saw this in third grade, fourth grade, all the science classes you ever went through. But the orange is in the probably melting ice caps now. And then all we have on the available for drinking is that fresh water, that 1%. And those are our surface waters. And it takes a lot of planning, management to make sure that we're using that 1% carefully and that we're using just the amount that we need, no more, no less, but that we have enough to continue to provide adequate for our customers. We're fortunate because the United States is probably the most, and European countries are probably the most progressive as far as the safety of water and the safety and the quality of the wastewater treatment, because it is a cycle. We do like to say that, you know, when we provide water to you, it's coming out of relatively pristine raw water sources. We're treating it at one of our treatment plants to make sure that when it goes through the system, it's meeting all state and federal guidelines. You use it, you flush it, and it becomes Raleigh or Cary's water supplies. But they can use it, and we occasionally use that Cary water supply to supplement ours when we need to, and I think James will get to that. But the entire country, even though we're so sophisticated and we've got these great systems, we have an infrastructure grade of D. And it's a scary number of 2.1 trillion gallons of water that are leaking every day. Just think how many people, if we captured all of that in these other countries, that could take care of. And then our own oldest lines date back to the early 1900s. If you have traveled into downtown Durham and you've been caught up in traffic, closures, detours, going to some of the better restaurants, you've noticed that. That is one of the investments, our own downtown water loop, replacing those lines that were built in the 30s. That's an $8 million project in and of itself. And we generally put about $5 million in our capital budget every year for replacement of water lines and rehabilitation of water lines. Another major challenge we have is just the lack of public appreciation. You did flush it and it went away. If it bubbled back up, you'd be calling us or calling a plumber, and that's when you say, oh gosh, we need to. So it's taken for granted. Some people consider it a right. We do get questions from people saying, why do I have to pay for it? Because it fell from the sky. But from the time it leaves Lake Mickey till it goes through that tap, a lot is done to it. There's also a level of disconnect. Again, you don't see it. The bulk of it is, other than the very publicly located Williams Water Treatment Plant, you don't know where the transmission lines are, and we like it that way. And you probably don't know where the raw water sources are unless you've taken recreation out there, and there is a reason for that. And a lot of people there's a willingness to pay for what it really costs. And the reason I was kind of concerned about their use of the term utility is because, you know, as a city function, or even as a utility in one of our neighboring areas that Mr. Foy will be talking about, it's not for profit. You know, we have to cover our cost of services and the cost of future infrastructure. So the little drop there in the corner is Imagine a Day Without Water. There is a association which we just became affiliated with called the Value of Water Coalition. It's across the country. And we actually had a day in October that was designated as Imagine a Day Without Water. It's October 6th, 7th, one of those days. It was a 2-day event that people could choose what day. And we actually produced a video that's played on Durham Government TV. And you can watch that. And people were talking about what they would miss most. And it seemed to be their coffee or their shower. I kind of thought that maybe they'd say, oh, I bet we couldn't do surgery at Duke that day. That's just me. We also face some additional challenges, just overall security. Contamination events, whether it's at our reservoirs or somewhere else in the system. The physical security, someone drove through a security fence at one of our wastewater facilities the night before last, sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. Fortunately, he didn't damage anything other than the fence, but we have to be aware of security at all times. Cybersecurity, we're running a whole lot more using sophisticated, SCADA technology. So our facilities are manned 24/7, 365. We do use a lot of SCADA, another technology to assist us in those operations. We also look at SCADA as it manages our wastewater collection stations. But if anything happens to them, it could change the whole chemistry or manage the processes differently, and we wouldn't be producing that product, which is heavily related. We also had to be planning for emergency management response. So we have emergency response plans for if the dams fail. We also have emergency response plans for contamination events that might occur right within the drinking water system. But we're always planning for all of those things. The other thing that we really are concerned with is just the amount of water. It's very finite. That was what the original slide showed you. It's always 1%. And until the water becomes contaminated, we don't have that percent. But we have water supply and the reliability of our water supply. So having it and having it a way to deliver it to our customers is very important. And it does depend on the ecosystems. We have to be very careful of managing things so that they don't impact the life of the aquatic life. And there's livelihoods that depend on that. So there's certainly a fair amount of uncertainty regarding the effect of quantity and quality and what climate change could have on that. One of the things we're looking at is North Carolina and this region in particular been considered a relatively water-rich state. So we've always been dependent on having about the same amount of rainfall, between 39, 38, and 45 inches of rain a year. That's a lot, and the Western folks won't be able to relate to that probably. But when that comes, now with climate variability, climate change, it may come all in the month of, December like we had this year. So it's, you have to be thinking about being able to store and how you're going to manage that. And one of the most significant regulations we're having to deal with is just the siting of a new reservoir is such a challenge. Our colleagues with the City of Raleigh have been trying to build a new reservoir, and I think they're in year 8 of working on that availability. And other changes are how people use water, how much they use and how they use it, and making infrastructure decisions based on making them fair to our customers, affordable, but also making sure that we don't have any shareholders, but so we are paying for everything, so we have to be wise stewards of that water. The next slide is a picture of what we hate most. This is our Little River Reservoir, one of our 2 reservoirs. This one was constructed in 1988. This is the side that usually has, this is the side that usually has water up to those piers. So that V area right there, you wouldn't see that. You wouldn't know that was a part of the structure if you were visiting that today. So that is one of the areas that we are always trying to prepare for is, what do you do when this happens, and how do you manage your demand? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to James.
So this is just a representation of our daily demand for the past, since 2000, so 15 years. That 2007, 2008 was that drought. So you can see we actually did see a dramatic reduction in consumption during that year, which we were going to attribute to our excellent conservation program. But overall, we're really happy to see that we've been able to reduce demand overall by quite a bit. And I think if you actually go back further. We at some days we were reaching 42 million gallons a day, and so now we've made some significant reductions in that, considering population growth and everything else. So one of the most effective ways to encourage water efficiency is obviously to hit people in their wallets. And so one of the things we did was adopt a tiered rate structure in 2009. And so Durham has a 5-tiered system, and this only applies really to single-family customers, and it's basically based on your consumption. So all of our non-residential customers, they just pay that $3 rate per unit, and then our irrigation customers pay the Tier 5 rate. The thought there is that all irrigation water is pretty much discretionary. So if you're going to choose to apply drinking water to your lawn, you're going to pay the most for it. Basically, we're rewarding our customers who use less water by charging them the lower rates. Let's see. And so here you can actually see where we implemented it again in 2009. You can sort of see over time how our consumption in the different tiers has changed. Particularly in that first year, we were able to reduce Tier 5 by almost 50%. We attribute that to a lot of people suddenly saying, why is my bill so high? And realizing they had leaks that they just were ignoring and were paying for. But now they're actually paying a lot more for it. So we've managed to sort of keep it our highest tier at around 2%. This is just the single-family residential, too. This doesn't include irrigation. And so we've seen a slight increase in the last couple years. That may be a reflection of the economy improving a little bit. I'm not sure, but hopefully we'll still keep it pretty low up there. And just for your reference, this is all cubic feet. And so like the 1,500, this tier, the last tier, is if you're using 1,500 cubic feet, that's just over 11,000 gallons. So some of the challenges we face just in terms of conservation is that conservation has sort of historically been viewed just as a temporary or a standby solution to water shortage. And so we struggle with trying to convince not just the public, but also our elected officials and regulatory bodies that conservation actually can be a long-term supply option. You know, if you're storing water or using less water, you're reducing the need for potential new reservoirs, which, as Vicki alluded to, are incredibly difficult to site and move forward with. So our program, Durham's program, conservation program, is actually the first conservation program in the state, so we're quite proud of that. What year did that begin? 1993, which is also the year that the plumbing code changed, North Carolina actually was able to adopt the water efficient plumbing code before the federal government did. So we were about a year in advance of the federal government on those the high efficiency plumbing standards. But we've been moving towards promoting more water efficiency. It's sort of a definitions issue, but promoting water efficiency in conjunction with conservation sort of being the saving of a natural resource and the efficiency being the how-to portion of how to save water, how to use it more wisely. So water efficiency is typically more technology-oriented, whereas conservation can be more behavior-oriented. And so we've been working really hard to sort of promote more of how to save water versus just telling you save water. And so our program, just going to go briefly kind of talk a little bit about how our program is structured. So other than rates, which again are the most effective way to get people to save water, the next probably most effective way is public education and outreach. And so that's a huge portion of our program. So we do events all the time. We do for school groups, youth groups, civic groups. We do an annual poster contest, which is that top middle slide there, or image there. We provide resources, booklets, brochures. We do media campaigns. You may have seen some of our television ads that run. So we run the gamut and we try to be out in the public. We try to use social media as much as possible. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. But yeah, so public education is just a huge piece, and obviously our goal is just to raise the awareness of the value of water again, and help people know how they can contribute to water efficiency and what people can do to conserve and the natural resource. The other thing we do is we offer water use assessments, which is us actually going into people's homes. We do single-family homes, multifamily homes, and businesses to an extent. And basically, the general purpose is just to educate customers about the wise use of water and how to make their homes and businesses more water efficient. So what we do is we identify leaks, we check for inefficient fixtures, and we replace them or provide replacements if they do have inefficient fixtures. So that's shower heads, aerators, things like that. And then we make recommendations on other habit changes, so it's us getting one-on-one with customers. A lot of the times we're used as sort of a leak detection service. We're cheaper than a plumber. So, but we do, it's a great opportunity for us to also, once we're there, to ask, after we've identified leaks, and we say, by the way, you should take a shorter shower, and this is how much your bill will go down, and things like that. So we do try to do those types of things. We do, as I mentioned, efficiency is sort of technology-based, and so one of the things we do is offer a number of different rebates and devices to the public. We have our probably most valuable rebate is we do offer a $100 rebate on high-efficiency toilets. These are toilets that use 1.28 gallons per flush. The current plumbing code is 1.6, and if you have a toilet older, 1993 or older, it's probably 3.5 gallons per flush. We see occasionally 5 or 7 gallons per flush toilets in some of our older homes. Vicki mentioned our lines are 1900. We have homes at the same time with toilets using, I don't know, toilets last a long time. And so if they don't break, nobody replaces them. So the rebate sort of helps to incentivize people to replace them sooner rather than later. We also sell and provide efficiency kits. These have a shower head, faucet aerators, kitchen aerators, all that meet WaterSense criteria. So WaterSense is EPA's program, and those criteria exceed the current plumbing code. And then we offer this. Everyone's like, what is this weird Lego piece? That is, it's a fill valve diverter for your toilet, so it just helps reduce the amount of water in your toilet. So if you're not going to replace your toilet, we can at least help your toilet operate more efficiently. And then lastly, we do rain barrels. So that helps people capture stormwater and use that effectively in their gardens rather than using treated drinking water. Beyond sort of the more soft and fuzzy stuff that we get to do, we also have some regulatory requirements. Those include our year-round ordinance enforcement. So Durham does have a year-round ordinance for irrigation, which is just an odd, even watering schedule. We did that in conjunction with our neighboring utilities, so we all have the same schedule to make it easy for people to understand. We also have the water shortage response plan that we have. And so this plan is basically directs us on when to implement phases of our ordinance, which would require conservation efforts on behalf of the community. So and this plan is not just drought. This could be if we had a major catastrophe or a line break that was significant enough that we actually needed people to save water. So the plan is a state-required plan. We submit it, it gets approved, all that stuff. So we do have to implement that and follow that regularly. This is Vicki's slide, actually. But so one of the things that was actually, they asked us to talk a little bit about how you all can help and get involved. So we put this together. Obviously, get involved. So that means, working with your whatever organizations, environmental organizations, policy organizations, talking to your elected officials. this out of sight, out of mind, be aware of infrastructure needs. We really want you to make sure you think about the infrastructure that's underground. Again, you don't see it, but it's there and it's important, so be aware of that. Just in general, develop an appreciation for water and make sure that you are sharing that with others. Utilizing the latest technology, so this could be, making sure you're using water-efficient devices at home, but also start investing or looking at things that help industry work more effectively, things like that. So knowledge is power, sort of share with others. We kind of talked about that. And then finally, environmental stewardship and watershed protection policies. We want you to make sure you're involved in those efforts. Keeping our drinking water safe is obviously really very important, so watershed protection comes into play with that. Oh, follow us on Twitter. I expect to see my phone to light up with all these followings.
Great, thank you very much. So our last speaker is Kevin Foy, who is a professor at North Carolina Central School of Law, and was former mayor in Chapel Hill. And I think we're all hearing, right, out of Michigan, out of Flint, about this important connection between governance, local governance, and the operation of the utility, right? And how local governance intersects with the daily operations that help the state. And so this is a nice opportunity to sort of hear from both sides. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Foy, and I was the mayor of Chapel Hill for 8 years. So I do want to talk about water issues in the context of policy, really, primarily. But as Megan said, I'm now teaching, and I teach environmental law, torts, which I'm sure is one of your favorite subjects, and business law. Those all intersect. So I have that perspective of teaching. But I also, when I practiced law, represented clients who had issues with wetlands mitigation or underground storage tanks that might be leaking into the groundwater. And prior to that, I managed a business. I was running a business that was highly regulated. We were inspected twice a day by federal inspectors. So I have a perspective from many points of view, not just from being a regulator, because that's essentially what you do when you're in office. Making sure that we have policies in place, and that there are effective ways to enforce those policies. So what I want to talk about is the intersection of water quality, water equity, and water conservation. So how does this go? The one on the right? Got it. Well, as you all know, and as people have been discussing today, there are these overarching federal rules, primarily the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act. So one is input and the other is output. Both of these major federal laws, have embedded in them these requirements, but what I want to point out is what you also heard from Lisa and James and Vicki. A state has primary enforcement responsibility for public water systems. I mean, that's a direct quote from the Act. The Clean Water Act, is the NPDES. It is the policy of the Congress, and this is from the policy statement, to recognize the primary responsibility and rights of states to plan the development and use of land and water resources. So it's not just the fact that we do it, it's the fact that this is the structure. And, we refer to this as cooperative federalism. Federal law sets the goals, let the states achieve the target, let the states achieve those targeted goals. But how does that happen? Well, I like that little slice of pie because, it's not that rigid as to whose responsibilities and where, federal, state, and local. But what is clear is that all the delegation goes to the bottom ultimately, which is local government, at least in the context of water regulation. So I want to talk about how it is that local government might choose to deal with water issues. And in my experience, this is the water utility that 3 local governments cooperatively formed: Chapel Hill, Carrboro, and the county, Orange County. It is an independent, nonprofit utility, serves 80,000 people, so quite a bit smaller than Durham, but doing the same kind of work. Here's a little bit of data on OWASA's infrastructure, where the water comes from, then it gets treated. This is a graph that a little graphic that shows what happens to that water once it goes, out of your house. I don't think you can read that very well, but it's a complex process. I mean, it's not just, oh, well, let's just send it to the wastewater treatment plant and then that's it. There's a lot that's involved. For example, 340 miles of sewer lines and 21 pumping stations, so everything's not necessarily gravity fed. This is important with regard to water equity and water conservation, as James and Vicki were pointing out. The financial management of OWASA, of our public water utility, is all cost of service. They have no taxing authority. All the revenue, this $35 million annual budget, paying all the employees, maintaining the capital improvement plan, all of that comes from ratepayers. Stormwater management is a separate issue. So in Chapel Hill, we formed a separate utility. So the structure can be, well, let's get together and form a utility as we did with water, with drinking water and wastewater management. But with stormwater, we're managing that separately, a utility that is completely under the umbrella of the city, the municipality. And it's structured a little bit differently in that the fee is on all properties. Because it's a fee instead of a tax, it applies to, for example, non-taxable entities like religious institutions. So it was deemed to be a more equitable financial management structure because it has to do, with how much impervious surface do you actually have responsibility for. If you're a property owner and you have a driveway, that's one thing. If you're a church and you have a large parking lot, that's another. And, we can talk about stormwater management. It has a lot of iterations. I want to point out the close connection between land use and water. And you can read that, but essentially, if you don't permit the water infrastructure, in other words, the pipes that take water to someplace, and the wastewater, which are the sewer lines, if you don't permit that, then you can't get very high density. And you certainly can't get a shopping center like that. I mean, you can't put a shopping center like that on a well and have a septic tank. So the way that you make decisions about land has an impact, and that's just one example, on the water supply, certainly the water quality and the water demand. In Chapel Hill, one of the ways in which we've dealt with this is to create an urban services boundary, which is, we just basically drew a line around the town and said, we're not extending water and sewer any farther. So if you want to put in a housing development, you're going to have to make sure that there's private water supply, that there's sufficient well water, and that you manage your septic systems on site. And so part of that was part of that urban services boundary was to protect against sprawl, but also part of it was to encourage efficiency within the urban boundary and discourage, outside the urban boundary. One way to protect water is to protect land. So this is another intersection between how you manage your land. So it's not just through zoning. It can also be through, for example, conservation easements. OWASA either owns the land or owns conservation easements of about 3,000 acres around the reservoirs. In addition, Chapel Hill zones the areas which we call a resource conservation district. We zone the areas around the streams to buffer them. And the zoning, you know that zoning cannot deprive a property owner of all use, but it does deprive the property owner of the ability to build close to streams so that you try to mitigate the potential runoff of pollutants into the waterways by restricting too much intense development, even inside the city limits, near waterways. Another way in which we try to, we use land management to protect water quality is to require on-site management of stormwater. So you might have a bioretention pond, or you might have some other way to actually prevent the polluted runoff from even residential properties, not just commercial properties. Water equity is sort of an evolving concept, I think, but if you look at what the United Nations has said for quite some time, it's not a new idea. Water is a human right. Well, okay, well, what does that mean? There must be sufficient quantity, there must be good quality, and there has to be accessibility. Well, what does accessibility mean? Accessibility means that you need to be able to get the quantity of good quality water without barriers, including economic barriers. This is where environmental justice is implicated, I think. Water availability and water affordability. So we haven't talked about Flint, but that certainly is an environmental justice issue. It's not a coincidence that it's a low-wealth community. And what does fair treatment and meaningful involvement mean in this context? Fair treatment and meaningful involvement is the way the EPA defines environmental justice. Well, there was no meaningful involvement in Flint because the people who lived there were complaining for apparently years about the quality of the water. Another thing to consider with regard to water equity is the vulnerability of a population to too much water. So in other words, where does it flood? Whose neighborhood floods? Because flood control and stormwater management are part of how you deal with water, and people typically who live in flood-prone areas are unable to move because of economic conditions. Who gets water and sewer? Well, this is one of the ways in which Chapel Hill has actually had a real problem with the Rogers Road community. The Rogers Road community is a primarily African-American community outside the city limits, but next to the city landfill. And so for the last 30 years, this community lived next door to the landfill. Because it was outside the city limits, it didn't have water and sewer. Instead, it had well water. So I'm showing you a diagram of how well water works. Basically, you're looking for groundwater that's drinkable. You bring it up. Okay, but how does a septic system work? Well, a septic system works by trying to on-site manage through filtration devices wastewater. And then it goes back down into the groundwater. I mean, this is the natural cycle. It's what Vicki was describing with regard to Jordan Lake, only on a micro level. Well, what happened with Rogers Road was the residents began to say, we're having problems with our drinking water. We think it's contaminated. And we think it's contaminated by your leaching landfill, because the landfill was unlined, at least until recently. And so this became a very complex issue with regard to the obligations of the obligation of the city, the obligation of Chapel Hill to these people who, did they or didn't they have a water problem, and whose responsibility was it? Whose responsibility is it? This problem with the potential for groundwater contamination that people were then consuming could have been solved in various different ways. But think back to what I mentioned about OWASA. First of all, OWASA does not extend water and sewer outside the urban services boundary. This is an area outside the urban services boundary. You could possibly solve the problem by annexing. But if you annex, then you create, for many people, unaffordability, because taxes basically double when you come into the city limits. So that was a problem, and the residents of Rogers Road really weren't interested in that. So what other possibilities do you have in this context? Supply public water somehow. Well, that is what Chapel Hill and Orange County did. Basically lay, water pipes. And we haven't made public sewer available because that's a different issue and actually more expensive. But what I want to point out is that it's not that simple. You can put down the water lines, you can put down the sewer lines, but what about these other costs? These little graphics are showing that the public utility, whoever it is, only brings water to a certain point. And the responsibility is for the public ends where the private property begins. So you still have, even after you've paid for all of that infrastructure, you have to put in the infrastructure to the private residents. Not only that, there's an ongoing cost of service of around $850 a year, which is going up. And look at the availability fees. Availability fees are, capital recovery, about $2,000. It depends on the size of the residence, so I'm just using, just a number. And a meter installation fee. Well, so basically you've got a $5,000 fee. Now, how do you manage that? Typically, if you had a place inside the city limits, the same costs would apply, and the property owner would be expected to finance that. So you don't get hit with a $5,000 bill, that you have to pay tomorrow. But you have to pay it, let's say, at $50 a month for the next however many years to amortize the debt. How do you do that in a community that is being retrofitted and is already low wealth and at least has some potential claim that it deserves reparations, essentially, for having put up with your landfill for the last 30 years? So another way in which, conservation and quality intersect with equity has to do with what James and Vicki were also talking about. This inverted rate model, puts pressure on people to use less water. And it's really ingenious in a way, because if you think about it, if you go to, Costco or Sam's Club, the whole business model is based on the more you buy, the cheaper it is, right? And that's how we used to structure water too. That's how our society works. When you invert it, you create an inverted incentive. So now the economic incentive is don't use water. Because, at least for us in Chapel Hill, the second 2,000 gallons is twice as much. And then it goes up from there. That can put pressure on, it's regressive in the sense that, what do you care if you make $500,000 a year, whether the water costs $6, per 2,000 gallons or $2? But you do care if you make $20,000 a year and you have, 3 kids you're trying to feed. Then it becomes a problem. And so that regressive model, goes back to the way in which we've structured the cost of service. Reclaimed water is a water conservation strategy that essentially is when you get to the point that You could put it back into the stream, back into the natural cycle. Instead, you put it into some use, like, for example, what we do in Chapel Hill is sell it to UNC so that they can use it for their cooling systems where they don't need to use drinking water. It's much cheaper for them. It's much cheaper for the utility. But it raises the cost to everybody else because now a large consumer, UNC, isn't buying as much water, but the infrastructure, the capital improvements, the maintenance, all of that, all those costs are fixed, and so they continue to, so the actual payment for those costs has to be shifted to somebody else. How do you deal with all of this? Well, as a matter of policy, essentially you have to convince the community by using good information that we can balance all of these competing demands. But we can only do it if we have a good, solid, community-wide planning process that puts in place an agreed system upon which we are all going to rely as we move on forward. So thank you.
And while you all are collecting your questions and your thoughts, I want to try to bring the panel together a little bit, right? And you framed the sort of federalism question, and I think I've sort of framed the federalism question as, localities being on the receiving end of all of this stuff. But I'm wondering, from the two cities' perspectives, what your thoughts are, both in the nutrient pollution particular case, but more generally, how much influence do localities have on these higher level policymaking processes that so much influence how you do your business? And also for Lisa, what's your experience with locality influence on these processes?
Well, speaking from the City of Durham's perspective, we try to participate in some of the stakeholder groups whenever DEQ or someone else has them available for us. We are members of large national and or international associations, the American Water Works Association and the Water Environment Federation, who have offices in Washington, D.C., and do a lot of advocacy. I wouldn't call it lobbying, but it's advocacy on behalf of water utilities, trying to point out to the legislative bodies on certain rulemaking opportunities that the impacts that their decisions will have on the ability for folks to deliver water and wastewater services. And there are more local associations. There's a water quality association in North Carolina that serves as a advocacy group, mostly focusing on the wastewater, water reclamation side of things, working directly with the the state DEQ on certain policies. But usually, a city will not have someone who can lobby on their behalf, like the state legislature. So we try to work collaboratively with the decision makers within like public water supply section, Division of Water Resources, to see how we can help influence, their decision making.
Water is highly political. It doesn't really look that way. When you have the session on Western water this afternoon, I'm sure you're going to hear a lot about that. But it's highly political here too. And so the reason is everybody's upstream from somebody, and so, but why do we care? Why does Durham care about Raleigh's water? And that's a big problem, because we can say we care, but what about when it's going to cost the city of Durham $1 billion? Was that what they said?
On the stormwater side, the estimates to comply with the Falls Lake rules would be $1 billion.
$1 billion. So, okay. Now what do you think the city of Durham had to say about cleaning up Falls Lake? they went running over to the legislature and explained why that maybe what was a little expensive. And the same thing with the Jordan Lake rules. You know, Greensboro and Burlington pollute Jordan Lake because it flows down through the Haw River, and they had very little interest in cleaning up Durham, Cary, Chapel Hill, and Raleigh's water, because why should they bear the cost? Because you have to think about the whole matter of internalizing the real cost of water, and really nobody wants to recognize that. So in answer to your question, I think that there is a lot of influence on politically at the local level as to what gets done. I'm not sure there's much influence as to how the standards actually get set.
And I can probably speak to this a little bit from the perspective of coastal communities. So on the North Carolina coast, they're really, outside of Wilmington, it's all rural. So there's no metro area that's there. And of course, they get everything in the estuary that kind of comes from everywhere west. So they feel a lot of pressure, especially from the nutrient perspective or any other perspective, is because a lot of it gets dumped in the estuaries at the end of the day. So when DEQ established these 3 critical areas, they were very specific and strategic about it. So High Rock Lake is a reservoir. So they specifically wanted to look at an estuary to develop as kind of a pilot area to develop these standards because of a lot of the pressures that are there. But a lot of these smaller communities, it's very difficult for them to participate in this sort of process because they are 3 hours away from Raleigh. They have very small staffs. They don't have much in the way of travel budgets. So they don't have this much, as much ability to be able to come to Raleigh to influence the legislative process. But at the same time, they're dealing with a lot of the rural areas on septic systems instead of centralized. So they are feeling the similar types of pressures because of aging infrastructure there and the lack of money to be able to do any retrofitting, rehab, or actually getting any new lines out there. So it's millions of dollars, and it's really, they have to raise some money to do it and raise the cost of water in order to do it. But these are some of the things a lot of them deal with, in addition to a lot of the hazards from flooding, sea level rise, things like that. Saltwater intrusion is a big issue with destroying the infrastructure. But a lot of them, they don't have as much of an opportunity to influence the process. So a lot of them try, in some way, to band together to really talk about their common issues. Sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. But their issues are pretty particularized. And when you're a rural area, you kind of find out that it's really. It's compounded the fact that you don't really have as much influence on how the standards get developed. You just kind of comment when there's a public comment period, when there's any rulemaking that's going to be proposed, and try to comment that way because their political voice is definitely not as strong as a metro area. So really kind of how the state balances that and how the local governments try to make sure that they're heard is something that, from a public policy perspective, is certainly a challenge.
Questions from the audience? Yeah.
Okay. So it's my understanding from all of this that there's limited federal and state funding available for water supply infrastructure repairs and just development in general, but that there's a pretty great deal of both needed across the nation, and that financial burden falls primarily on local governments. And so I was wondering, how does the city of Durham or the city of Chapel Hill prioritize repair projects? And is that data describing, needs and allocation decisions made publicly available?
So it is very expensive. And I would say that the 2 water reclamation facilities that Durham built or expanded in the early 90s were our last use of sort of like the state revolving fund. We haven't applied for those funds. They typically, in more recent years, have gone towards smaller utilities, smaller operations. So we have, our CIP program, and we are funding everything through our capital improvements program. So yes, our customers are paying for it. Our ratepayers, not taxpayers, they're ratepayers. So it is built into a part of the bill. When we look at our department budget, it's, say, $42 million for the annual operating budget, and then another sort of equal $42 million is set aside for doing all the debt financing process. And I'm not the person that understands that, but Mr. Hughes is here and can explain that. But it can be a challenge, because that's one of the things that we're talking about, is how do you make it as affordable as possible without making it too outrageous for people. We try to do very small rate increases every year, and we have provided the opportunity for folks to, at least in the single-family residential side, to manage their discretionary use and to achieve a lower rate. But I think there's another part to your question.
Yeah, I was mostly wondering, and that's all wonderful too, because it helps me frame my question, but how does the city of Durham have like a list of
Prioritization.
Projects?
Yes, we have a list of projects. We have a 5-year CIP, which is about $500 million. And we prioritize it based on, here's an example. We're getting ready to issue RFPs for construction of an expansion to our larger water treatment plant, to expand it from 30 million gallons to 42 million gallons. This has been a 7-year process as far as moving it forward with environmental permitting. We've had the design pretty much ready to go, and it's been mostly tied up in environmental permitting, modeling, questions raised from our colleagues with the city of Raleigh, who are concerned about, if we take a little bit more water out of Lake Mickey, what does that do to Falls Lake on both a water quality and water quantity side? So we're fortunate that we've been able to manage demand, so it was not critical that we were absolutely had to build it when we first started. So we've been able to prioritize it that way. A lot of times it's just, you have a list, we're gonna go here, 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 like some of the water line replacements, to a very, we do a lot of internal studies and assessments, so we can say, well, we thought these were old, but these are still working good, but these were installed 15 years later, and they're bad. And it's a constant reevaluation of those projects, but it takes a lot of studying and managing of all the different parts of the infrastructure to see who goes first.
And the way our utility is structured is that there are 9 members of the board of directors, all of whom are citizens, appointed by the city. And that board of directors makes the decisions about the professional staff's recommendations. It's developed in a public process. The board of directors meets twice a month. Everything's open to the public, subject to the open meetings law. And as Vicki said, the capital improvements project plan is always in flux. And so, yes, it's a transparent process, and it relies on both professional opinions and citizens who show up.
And if I could just add, we do have a citizens CIP committee that reviews all the capital improvement projects. Generally, they apply more scrutiny to any general fund projects because it's overarching citywide. Because we are separately funded, with water and sewer rates, they don't give us as intense a scrutiny because they recognize that of the long planning stages.
Hannah, and then Reich, and then we probably need to Reich.
In the sort of the bigger conversation about equity, and we've hinted at what's going on in Flint, I'm just curious if, as utilities, if you guys have a perspective on how this issue has been covered, if there's something somewhat missing in the conversations, the way people are reporting on what's been happening in Flint, either the different forces that might not be talked about, because you understand probably more the systems that exist how these Flint utilities have been operating up to this point, and what led them to the decisions they've made. I mean, I know this is a broad question.
There's a lack of information right now, and I think people are jumping to a lot of conclusions that would that they may regret saying later. So I don't want to be one of them, but what I will say is that part of the decision apparently was driven by money. And, you know, and it looks like that was a very short-term view of cost. So it's kind of like what Frank was saying in the prior panel about why Duke has chosen to do what they did with the coal ash ponds, because it was cheap. Well, now what are the long-term consequences of that? It seems like a similar situation with Flint.
We are preparing to answer questions if our customers ask them. And one of the things we look at is, could it happen here? And we would like to say no. But I would totally agree with what Kevin has said. There's, I think, a lot of lack of information and money being the bottom line, and that's not how you need to make those decisions. You need to have the full picture, and I think they were looking for sort of like a quick fix for a couple of reasons.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask a little bit about the disconnect between a city's interest in, or a municipality's interest in growing its tax base by allowing sprawl development, which also directly increases stormwater impacts and cost of infrastructure, versus revitalization of urban cores and denser city centers, which may require replacement of aging infrastructure, but would not increase the overall impervious surface. Because it seems like one of the continuing problems we see in the Piedmont, when you're talking about that growth around Burlington and Greensboro, it's not high-rise office buildings or condos, it's sprawl. And that's what's causing the increase in the impervious surface. That's what's causing the impacts to Jordan Lake. And I don't care how many blenders you throw in there, it's not going to fix the problem. So what do you all think about the difference between the tax base and the desire of local governments to grow by increasing the tax base, which is based on assessments on real property, versus the problems that you see and that you have to deal with in the wastewater business on a rate basis?
Well, you know, something that you just sort of glanced on is something that is not obvious, but the connection between sprawl, water pollution, and the Department of Transportation. You know, why do we sprawl? Well, because you can get from Mebane to Research Triangle Parks since we widened I-40, since we put I-40 in. You know, nobody did that until we did. So everything is interconnected. But in answer to your direct question, the finance group that talks this afternoon is going to talk, I think, about some of this, but it's a lot cheaper to provide all municipal services to densely packed communities, whether it's bus service or water and sewer. And so to me, it's a mirage to think that somehow you're going to grow the tax base by sprawling. There's no economic model that I'm aware of that shows anything other than a short-term injection of new tax money. And you know, my philosophy as the mayor of Chapel Hill was, we're not a government because we need to make money. Governments are not for profit. So why are we always making decisions based on growing the tax base? It's a mirage that people throw at you in order to try to entice you into making long-term unwise decisions, in my opinion.
It would not be my place to comment on the tax base portion. I could just say that from providing services perspective, when anyone wants to tie on for us, whether it's a new development or a new business, they come through our development office. If there's lots of times when we do not extend services, we do go outside the city. And for developments that are outside the city, they pay double those rates you saw. So that is one way that sort of can incentivize someone to maybe not locate in that area. Not always, because if they build a house, they sell the house, you know, they don't really have a concern about that. But that is one tool that we use. But, you know, I'm not going to comment anything more than to say the 751 controversy sort of echoes why you don't want to provide services in certain areas. And politics are rampant in that. And I have no voice in that one.
And with politics are rampant, I think we should thank the panelists very much.
All right, everyone. Lunch is right outside.